Thanks so much for staying with us here on The Real Story. Another mass shooting, this time in Maine, not just leaving death, injuries, and trauma in the community targeted, but opening old wounds once again here in Connecticut. Joining me now is Jeremy Stein, Executive Director of Connecticut Against Gun Violence. Jeremy, thank you as always for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Of course, as you know, we just said, this tragedy in Maine, Connecticut's been where Maine is now, and the state's taken great strides to increase gun control and invest in prevention, but we tend to hear the same echoes after shootings. Something needs to change. What has changed in recent years, not just here in Connecticut, but across the country?
Sure. I think, the lesson to be learned with Maine is this is the price of inaction. We have seen these terrible tragedies happen before, but I think the difference is in Connecticut, we acted. We have passed some of the strongest gun laws in the country, and as a result, we have some of the lowest gun death rates. One law in particular was a ban on assault weapons. Another one, which probably could have prevented this tragedy, was what is known as our red flag laws, or extreme risk protection orders, also known as risk warrants in Connecticut. And this is a really important law that allows police in an emergency situation where someone is at imminent risk to harm themselves or others to be able to remove guns from that dangerous situation. And I think what we have learned is that this was an individual in Maine who was known to have some real mental health concerns and was known to have firearms, including assault weapons.
Right. And there tends to be a lot of frustration, even in a state like Connecticut that, as you just said, has passed a lot of gun control laws. The state just passed one of the biggest packages since Sandy Hook this past legislative session. But, a lot of people wonder if these laws have teeth and if/how they're really being enforced. How do we ensure that these laws are working, and how do we know?
So I think that what we need to do, and what we have been doing in Connecticut, and more so across the country, is we need to make sure that we are researching these laws, right? So the first thing is, passing the laws. Second is enforcing them, making sure that the police and state's attorneys and prosecutors are then enforcing them. But then we have to study these laws. And in particular, I just mentioned our red flag laws. Yeah. That is something that has been extensively studied by places like Yale and UConn and Duke. And we know they work. We know for every about 10 times that this law is utilized, it saves at least one life.
Wow. Yeah. Although Maine actually doesn't have the best score from a lot of institutions when it comes to their gun control legislation, I think a lot of people often think of New England sort of as a region as a whole as safer, as a lot of the states surrounding Maine, one of them just 3 hours south being here in Connecticut, as having a lot of gun control legislation. It's, as you kind of said at the start, it's rare now to see a mass shooting up in this area. Does this reveal anything to us as far as state regulations versus federal laws or action?
Well, gun violence is a very local thing, and so we need to make sure that we are addressing local concerns. Gun violence in Connecticut may look drastically different than a place like Vermont or Maine. Yeah. So that's why it's so important for organizations like ours, like Connecticut Against Gun Violence, to keep making sure that we are passing laws at the state level. However, we cannot legislate to other states. So we see guns coming from places like Maine into the state of Connecticut. We see guns from states that have much weaker gun laws, whether we're talking about Maine or Georgia or Texas. And those guns, which are easy to purchase in other states, make their way into states that have very strong gun laws, like Connecticut or Massachusetts. So we need to make sure that all 50 states have similar laws, like permitting laws or background checks. And if we can't get 50 states to do it, then we need Congress to act, because we need policies that are going to work in all 50 states universally.
Yep. And I want to talk about the federal action as well, but first, you mentioned obviously individual states can't legislate what's happening in other states, but I think we've seen Connecticut's laws as sort of a legislative blueprint for some other states that have then adopted similar measures. But right now we're seeing a lot of legal challenges to multiple states' laws, including here in Connecticut, and especially with recent Supreme Court decisions to reverse certain gun policies. What are the concerns and conversations with that right now?
Well, I think the biggest concern right now is what's probably going to be heard by the Supreme Court on, I believe, November 7th, Election Day. This is the Rahimi case. And this is going to be a case where the Supreme Court's going to decide whether or not states have the ability to prevent domestic abusers from having firearms. And so what we saw in Texas was a federal court strike down a law that allowed the state to remove guns from those people who had already been convicted of domestic violence abuse. And so the Supreme Court is going to decide whether or not the state has the right to protect its public, whether or not there is a real public concern and they have a right to remove guns, or whether we are just going to forget about our safety, and then the Second Amendment is going to take priority over the safety of women across the country. So I think that's going to be an important opportunity for the Supreme Court to get it right.
When it comes to federal action, the White House just launched the Office of Gun Violence Prevention, something our state's federal lawmakers were a driving force in, as well as you. You were there in D.C. for that ceremony. In press briefings this week, the Biden administration spoke to how much of a priority this needs to be. So what actually is this office, and what is it looking or hoping to accomplish?
This is the first ever Office of Violence Prevention. And we are grateful for the Biden administration to do this and to listen to the people, to listen to the advocates, to listen to the survivors who experience gun violence across this country. And so what this office is going to be doing, and it's going to be headed by the vice president, but also two activists who have been in the trenches for years, Greg Jackson and Rob Wilcox. And part of what they're going to be doing is making sure that the Bipartisan Safety Act, which Chris Murphy helped to pass and introduced, which was a massive funding bill, to make sure that this is being implemented across the country. They're going to be listening to survivors, looking at cities, making sure that we have unified, holistic policies, but most importantly, looking at root causes of gun violence and making sure that we invest in communities, because in a lot of these communities that are experiencing gun violence, like Hartford, New Haven, and Bridgeport, gun violence is a symptom of a bigger problem, and we need to make sure we're investing in these communities and that we are looking at the root causes. And
in our last minute here, talking about that investment and looking at those root causes, I know there's been some movement to try and do that on the local level here. Do you feel like this new federal office will help sort of look at those root causes and look at prevention as well as mental health, which I know is a big focus people kind of always point to? I think so. And what we have in Connecticut that we helped enact a couple of years ago was a commission on community gun violence. And that office, we proudly sit on that commission. That office is housed within the Department of Public Health in Connecticut. And I think that's so important because gun violence is truly a public health crisis. And it has to be addressed like any other public health crisis. We need to address gun violence just like we did with COVID. And so we need to be making sure that we are looking at research, we're getting other agencies unified, that we're looking at education, mental health, housing, homelessness, poverty, and racism. Well, Jeremy, thank you as always. That's all the time we have, but we always appreciate you speaking with us. It's my pleasure as well. Well, you can find further resources and breakdowns of Connecticut and national laws on the free Fox 61 News app or on our website at fox61.com. And you can watch The Real Story every Sunday at 10 a.m. right here on Fox 61 and streaming on Fox 61 Plus. Have a great morning.